I'm going to invite Carol Galante, Terner Center founder, to come up and lead a framing conversation for us titled, Does Supply Really Matter? A Review of the Evidence. And then we'll bridge into our first full panel of the day, which will follow, titled The Politics and Practice of Density, which will be moderated by Leah Brooks, professor at the Tract and Wick School of Public Policy at George Washington University. So first over to you, Carol. I should say, Carol, like all three of our guests, really are perfect. They couldn't do better from central casting. They span the research and practice world very nicely. Carol, as most of you know, past FHA commissioner, Bridge Housing CEO alum, former faculty at UC Berkeley, and perpetual instigator of tough questions and bold actions, is perfectly situated to kick us off. Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for everybody being here. I'm really excited to do this panel with my two esteemed colleagues here. And I don't know how we got Vicki and Vince, like two V names, to start off the panel, but it's great. So I'm going to introduce each of them really quickly because we only have 30 minutes. 29. And I really want to be sure that we get into the meat of it here. But as Ben said, all three of us have been in and out of the academy, spending time there, as well as spending time in government and public policy making. And I'm going to start my questions with Vicki, who is a law professor at NYU and with the Furman Center, also former deputy mayor of New York City, and also worked for the Housing and Preservation Department. So lots of great background here. So Vicki, I want to start with you on the article that you and Ingrid Gould-Ellen and Kathy O'Regan did back in 2018 on supply skepticism. We're here to set the context for land use and housing supply, how we get more housing supply. What motivated an article on supply skepticism? Who's skeptical? Why are they skeptical? And what did your research show in terms of the impact of housing supply?
Okay, well, first of all, thank you, Carol, and thank you to the Terner Center for having us here. It's really great to see so many great minds in housing all in one place. So really delighted to be here. I mean, what really motivated that early article, and we've done an update of that article, which you have a link to some summaries of it. But what really motivated it was certainly as housing commissioner and as folks at the Furman Center who were intimately involved in all of the fights over development in New York City. We were seeing just a complete disconnect, right? The kinds of arguments that we would hear in public hearings were so different from what the economists and what public policy people were thinking. And so we were really trying in that article to sympathetically but rigorously look at the arguments that we were hearing from the public and try to have the two sides be talking to one another. And so one of the things that we heard constantly was really a few things. I mean, one, to start, is a basic a question of ideology, right? The argument was we shouldn't be using any land for market rate housing. Land is a scarce resource. We should be using everything that we have for affordable housing or now social housing. And of course, that ideological debate is the backdrop against which we're all working, and we need to really think through the arguments there and really address what's the long-term plan. As deputy mayor in New York, I was in charge of our, almost at that point, 200,000 units of public housing, which was not getting the support that it needed to maintain, to continue. So social housing needs to have a long-term plan for how exactly it's going to be financed and how we're going to be sure of that. So that ideology, really starts the conversation. But then people were really also saying, look, I don't think that more supply is actually going to do any good. It's not really going to reduce rents, right? Or they were saying it might do good, but it has a lot of harms for the local community. It might do a good thing for the city as a whole or the region as a whole, but in my community, it's going to cause displacement, it's going to cause gentrification, and so why should I bear that cost? Another issue that we heard a lot about is, well, that when you build market rate housing, it's all luxury housing, and nothing happens in the lower tiers of the market. Increasingly, I mean, since we wrote that article, I think the conversation has also shifted. One thing that we're hearing a lot today is, look, we're just not using our housing efficiently. There's too much second homes or third homes or fourth homes. There's too much in short-term rental. There's too much held off the market for just investment purposes. Or we should just take all the old offices that aren't being used and convert them into housing, and then we'd solve the problem and don't need to build anything new. And then last, there's also another argument today really about the effect of all these land use reforms, right? People who are skeptical about whether the kinds of land use reforms that we're talking about are really going to do any good, right? Going to produce enough housing to actually do good. So what we tried to do in that earlier article and then have updated with research that many of you in the room are doing is to really look dispassionately and as sympathetically as we can to the arguments that we're hearing and try to address those kinds of arguments. And I'm happy to talk through that research. Is that?
Yeah, why don't you give us a high level?
Okay, perfect. So just to go back through some of those, I mean, one is, of course, the main argument that we hear all the time is it's not going to do any good. We're not going to see a decrease in rents. We're not going to see a slowing in rents. And there is several really good new studies that show that, in fact, when you have more supply, rents slow or rents actually decrease. Brian Asquith, Evan Mast, and Davin Reed have done work across 11 cities in the United States and have found that they see pretty significant reductions in rents. Xiaodi Li has a paper out in New York showing decrease in rents. Kate Pennington used fires in San Francisco as a natural experiment. She found decreases in rents. So we really are starting to see very good, very rigorous research that addresses that first set of problems. There are some contrary studies, so we really need to understand more about what in a particular city makes it work or doesn't make it work. Similarly, I think some of the most exciting of the new research is really addressing that question of, well, will building at market, what effect does that have on submarkets, on markets of lower rent housing? And we have two just really incredible studies that build basically the housing chain. If I move into a market rate housing, I leave a unit empty. Who moves into that? Who moves into theirs? And how does that affect the rents at different levels of the market? And those housing chain studies are showing that, in fact, that housing chain produces more competition, more units available at every part of the income distribution in the market quite quickly, right? So we see, for example, in a study in Oslo that looked at every new market rate apartment generated about 4.5 moves that freed up other units. And once you got to the second or third round of the moves, you were seeing it being available to people making below median income in the communities. So we're really seeing quite interesting and very useful research there. The most exciting part of that was that in the European research, they had, of course, incredible data, which we all wish we had, about the actual incomes and family situations, household situations of the people who were moving. And so they could actually see that it was lower income people who were moving up as units became available because of the housing chain. And they had the most incredible, for researchers, experiment, because they were at the same time that they were looking at this market rate, high-end housing in some of the best resourced neighborhoods. They were also doing an experiment to put subsidized housing in those neighborhoods, same neighborhoods. And so they looked at the housing chains that were being created from the market rate housing and from the subsidized housing. Of course, the first move or two are over here in the subsidized housing have income eligibility requirements, so they look different. But by the time you reach the third or fourth rung of the housing moves, they looked exactly the same, right? So the market rate housing was producing housing at those lower income tiers just like the subsidized housing was. So some really, remarkable research there. One of the key questions here, of course, is does new housing create displacement, force people out by bringing prices in the neighborhood up? And of course, seeing that it does lower rents is one answer to that. But also some of the research, Kate Pennington's in San Francisco, for example, finds that where you are providing new housing, the risk of displacement of forced moves, economically forced moves, declines by about 17%. So there's Karen, I'm sure we'll talk later about some of Karen Chappell's work that looks at also at who is moving into those neighborhoods, who is moving out of those neighborhoods, and finds that people in the lower income segments of the housing market are continuing to move into those neighborhoods. And in many of those neighborhoods, you're not seeing them move out. You're seeing a decrease in the amount that they move out. So a lot of really, really interesting research that I think will really help this debate. But I have to say, I was at the Taylor Swift concert last night with my daughter. I looked around at those 70,000 people and thought, how many are supply skeptics? How could we bring them over? So that's our task.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, it was a great, great overview. And I think for me, it's just, I've been part of these debates for a very, very long time. And seeing all this new research, even since 2018, it's just really helpful in terms of, having that available for policymakers at the state, local, and federal level. So I'm going to turn to Vince. Vince is actually on leave from University of Pennsylvania to in my hometown of Philadelphia, to the White House Domestic Policy Council as a senior housing advisor. And it's just great to see again that mix of solid housing researcher with getting involved in the policy debates at the federal level. And I want to start asking you, Vince, the White House and the Biden-Harris administration really, for the first time in my memory, has really put their thumb on the scale of housing issues and housing supply issues in particular in a way that doesn't necessarily fit into any one housing finance program, et cetera, and really, coming up with a housing action plan. And I'm just curious for you to start with what really motivated that. Like, what was it that got the administration to say, this is something that we really need to focus on, and then, tell us a little bit more about what these housing action plans are up to, including the most recent announcement about not just new housing supply, but lowering the cost of housing at the same time. So that's a mouthful, but go for it.
Well, thank you. Again, total privilege to be here and to be on the stage with both of you. And so a core part of the president's economic vision is essentially an economy where everyone can afford a safe, decent, affordable housing home, right? And we know housing is a major driver of inflation, which is driven by a longstanding housing shortfall. and it's basically made everyone's housing affordability that much harder, and their overall ability to afford basic necessities in life that much harder, right? We also knew during the pandemic that we were responding to one of the biggest economic crises in our nation's history, but we also knew that we were upfront and confronting a lot of longstanding inequities that were very structural to our housing market. And so early on in the administration, the Council of Economic Advisors actually released a really thoughtful and thorough piece on the importance of housing supply to our broader economy, to social welfare, to regional and economic development, to the kind of multiple ripple effects along the way. And that CEA piece really put out kind of new data, but also relied on a lot of the evidence that a lot of the folks in the room here have produced over time, right? And really making the case for the federal role in thinking critically about expanding housing supply, and particularly around issues of housing affordability. And so that piece, on top of the president's vision and what we were seeing during the pandemic, really fueled the impetus to create the first ever White House Housing Supply Action Plan, right? And what that Housing Supply Action Plan was really meant to do was be really reflective of a whole of government approach to housing, acknowledging that every agency has an equity in this, and trying to bring all of the federal tools to bear, acknowledging that clearly our housing affordability challenges could be addressed by proactive efforts from Congress to pass many wonderful bills out there right now around the neighborhood homes tax credit, the low-income housing tax credit, a whole bunch of other things. But beyond that, we have to really think creatively about all the levers we actually have at our disposal and how to use those. Coming to the supply skepticism bit, though, I would say one of the things we're clearly thinking about is that we're leaning into housing supply, but we're also acknowledging the really important complementarities of all the other things that make a fair housing market. And so that's why we created our blueprint for a Renter's Bill of Rights, which was the first for the White House. We acknowledge the critical role in housing supply in our federal strategic plan to prevent it in homelessness. And all of these plans are really kind of interlinked in kind of a broader vision around housing itself. So a couple of weeks ago, as Carol said, we released a couple fact sheets, two actually on one day. One of our friends jokingly called it a double album of housing policy. So one was on lowering housing costs, another was on renter protections. And we were really, did that on the same day intentionally, right? Because we realize too often we're having a housing supply conversation separate from a renter protection conversation. And in doing that, we're pitting one versus the other, right? And so a critical area for research going forward, right, is really looking at those tensions and opportunities and not just kind of pitting them against each other, but seeing how they really do complement each other in really critical ways. And so in that announcement, we highlighted a bunch of actions. So in kind of three big themes, right? And this is, I guess, the second output we put from our supply action plan. One was about reducing barriers to building housing, like restrictive and costly land use and zoning practices, whole host of programs that are meant to align with that. HUD's pro-housing program, which is incentivizing essentially unsticking the development process. $85 million going towards that. We're really excited about that. We're hopeful that a lot of research will come from that about what worked and what didn't actually work from that. The Economic Development Authority is actually making land use and zoning and housing affordability, particularly as it connects to jobs, one of their investment priorities. So again, kind of going beyond just HUD, thinking about our broad set of agencies who we could bring to the table. Research has long talked about the importance of leveraging DOT for thinking about critically about our housing affordability issues, thinking about location affordability, all those kinds of things. And so we also spoke to a bunch of actions there, not the least of which is over the term thus far. We've included incentives around land use zoning and housing supply in over $10 billion of DOT funding, including most recently their Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods program, which actually has a $450 million regional partnership challenge, which is essentially like a challenge grant to get different parts of a region to work together to essentially unstick access issues where land use and zoning are a key part of that. Beyond that, we're thinking of expanding financing for affordable housing, energy efficient housing, and resilient housing, and really trying to also kind of pull these narratives together. Really excited about EPA's Greenhouse Gas Emissions Fund, which is going to unlock capital that can go into a whole host of housing investments, including the new construction of net zero housing. HUD has its Green, Resilient, and Retrofit program, which is meant to essentially help upgrade a lot of our existing HUD multifamily programs. But we're also thinking about tweaks we can make to existing programs to make them work better. So right now there's a proposed rule around ways to consider rental income from an ADU, to incorporate that into financing, and really kind of thinking about that as a critical part of piecing things together. One of the things I had mentioned last night, and I think is really important, again, as we think about research, is acknowledging no one of these tools is essentially solving all of our problems. So how does the layering of them actually work together and get to some of our affordability goals, some of our energy efficiency goals in a really efficient way? One thing I want to highlight here is actually also our state and local fiscal recovery funds. One of the things we did was we actually created flexibility so it could be used to housing, and DOT and HUD, or Treasury and HUD actually put out a how-to guide about how to actually use it for housing. So we're trying to really think about how to unlock all of our resources for housing. I think there's a lot of opportunity for case studies in places that have done it well, not have done it well. What can we learn from this? What does it mean going forward? The last thing we announced was an effort on essentially exploring opportunities around commercial to residential conversions. Again, we know that that's not the solution to all of our challenges, but it acknowledges that there are opportunities there, and with our broad set of federal partners, how can we think creatively about where those opportunities are? How can we align financing with those? And how can we kind of direct research? So HUD is actually released a NOFO 2 weeks ago, promoting research in this area, kind of baseline knowledge of what does the landscape look like, but also case studies of where has it been done, how has it been done, what can we actually learn from that? So again, and I come back to saying that within all of that context, we're thinking about housing supply and really excited about all the things we're unlocking and all the little things we're doing. I could go on with some numbers and some other small programs, but I'll just stop there and say we're again, though, thinking critically about like how we think about broader issues of neighborhood investment, how we think about concerns about displacement, how we think about goals of affordability, and really making sure that as much as we can, we're seeing these things as really critical complements to essentially the kind of neighborhoods and cities that we want to see 10 years from now, but hopefully more immediately as well.
That's great. In the time we have left, I want to drill down on two questions. One is, how do we lower the cost of production? And we heard Jenna talk about, time is money, and the financing programs and putting them all together. We also heard her mention, industrialized construction. I'm just curious from your experience, Vicki, in New York City, what is the biggest, is there, we know that it's going to take many, many policies, but is there one thing, if you had one thing you could do to make it more cost effective to build the homes that we need, and particularly at the, at least workforce housing level, or, middle income and lower, what would you do, or what did you do in New York City that would be, you think had the biggest impact?
So look, I think the time that it takes to get the entitlement, get the financing, get it built, get those houses, get those homes in people's hands is just way, way too long. And that's, it's death by 1,000 cuts. And it's pitted against sort of community engagement and due process and all of those, all good things. But we have to understand there's a cost to those good things, and how much are we going to, to slow things down in order to have more community engagement or more opportunities for judicial review of different things. So having a really strong sense of what are we trading off here, which people don't recognize the trade-offs, right? They just don't. They are, the perfect is often the enemy of the good, and so you'll get an argument that, well, we need, some additional time for this kind of study or whatever. That additional time added to all the other time is what makes housing so costly. And so I think a real attention to the trade-offs of what we're asking for or what people are asking for that are on their face perfectly justifiable, indeed honorable, right? But what are they costing us? And how can we try to find some way of accomplishing those objectives, but do it in a way that doesn't add more and more time and layers of review. And the more time you have and the more layers of review that you have, the more veto points you get in litigation. So it just sort of compounds. So I think that's really critical. And I want to say on that point that what the federal government did during the pandemic in issuing those emergency housing vouchers and saying, you got a year to get those on the street and leased up, right? And everybody was like, well, you can't possibly do that. What about this hearing and that ability to challenge the denial of eligibility for a voucher and all of those things? What about those? And the federal government saying, you got a year, get it done. And you found ways to get it done. And we need that sort of urgency and that sort of, well, let's rethink things from the ground up here about what's really essential to get things moving. It is really important.
It's like declaring the state of emergency that we really do have, and getting the processes to align with that urgency. Vince, do you have of the again, many things that the federal government is doing, are there particular things that you're excited about could have the big impact?
Yes. First, I want to acknowledge that was a great Taylor Swift pun, Death by a Thousand Cuts. Well done. I'm very disappointed.
Snuck that in. Sorry.
I've been texting in Taylor Swift puns all week, and I'm sad that I haven't come up with one here. So that said, no, I think there's a lot of really small things that make the policy nerd in me excited, but also I think like seedlings for kind of larger things that will have impact over time, right? So things like the Federal Finance Bank's risk sharing program has actually already led to the production and preservation of 12,000 affordable units. That's like a really small tool, right, that actually has really significant impact and unlocks a segment of the market and allows more units to be built, and particularly affordable units along the way, right?
And that's because, why is that?
I mean, because you're essentially doing the risk sharing, right, and allowing housing finance agencies to essentially take on multifamily loans that they might not have been able to otherwise, right? So that essentially creates more liquidity in the market and more lending activity, particularly in the multifamily affordable space, right? And therefore, there's kind of a volume thing that happens that might not have happened otherwise for what is essentially largely a secure asset, right? So really kind of leveraging the federal tools in that way, right? Similarly, thinking about the idea that with FHA multifamily mortgage insurance, increasing the large loan limit, right? It's not revolutionary, but it decreases the costs, right? Exactly. And so those decreasing the cost allows more deals to happen. It allows them potentially to be more affordable. It allows time to move a little more quickly, things along those lines. I will say, though, we are in a moment, too, where we do have a lot of exciting money that's gone out the door. I mean, I appreciate you saying the voucher point, Vicki. We saw an expansion of 100,000 vouchers since the start of the administration, a lot of those emergency housing vouchers, but also some of those normal project-based Section 8 vouchers. We know that clearly we need more supply to actually absorb the vouchers so people can use them. But these are really kind of critical resources. With ARP, state and local fiscal recovery funds, we know there's already over 2,500 projects in development using those funds that are going to be towards affordable housing. We also know that through Home ARP, there's another 20,000 plus additional affordable units. So we know with resources we can actually do stuff. I will say maybe some optimism here. The president put together what I think is one of the most exciting housing budgets in some time. Hopefully you checked it out. It was $150 billion across a broad set of things. Reintroduces the idea of project-based Section 8, new construction in that space, looking at not just housing supply incentives, but also specifically affordable housing supply subsidies to actually increase our stock of affordable housing supply, guaranteed rental assistance for youth Asiatic foster care, extremely low-income veterans, like all of those kinds of things. So I guess I'm a little bit optimistic that maybe something of that will come through and we could actually see the impact of that here.
Great, thank you. So my last question, I know we've got to sum up here, but just the pandemic and its impact, like has there been research or yet on the impact of the pandemic on where we need supply or how we should be thinking about, adding supply. There's the conversion of office buildings. So I'm just wondering, given the great thinkers that you both are, whether that's part of, the thought process that both the administration is looking at as well as researchers.
Well, certainly at the city level, where New York City is very concerned about this issue, of course, but we're seeing lots of people come back to the city that we didn't expect to come to the city, right, because of work from home and other things. So I think it's still a little bit too early, in part because, for example, in New York City, we're just seeing a lot of firms say, hey, come on back, and what that's going to do, and also it's juxtaposed with, with problems in cities, crime and other issues that are also posing a problem. So I think it's a little early to tell, but there is research underway.
I would say that, one of the clear unfortunate parts of the pandemic is we saw our housing affordability challenges really kind of get exacerbated across the whole country, right? And in some places that traditionally had not really known this problem until that point, with a lot of folks moving to whole new destinations or remote living, all those kinds of things. And that clearly presents a unique challenge, but also a unique opportunity around the real imperative to address issues of housing supply and housing affordability as a real national problem, not just like a high-cost, big city problem, but actually an issue that we're seeing across the country. And I think in some ways the pandemic has really elevated that to a much broader national conversation, which is enabling things like this here today.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you both so much. Please help me thank our panelists.